I actually think reason itself is in some ways mystical, right?
Mhm.
Is in some ways divine. And I think what needs to happen is that people need to begin to look at it, through that lens. So I'm a big advocate of realism. After I did all of my sort of philosophical study and things like that, one of the convictions that I came to was that all of the history of ideas, or at least one useful way of looking at the history of ideas, is to say that all the history of ideas is just this, it's just the story of two roads, two different answers to one question. And that one question is the question of realism.
Yeah.
So for those who are unfamiliar, realism really is just, it recognizes this, that, you and I and every other human being, from the moment we, can speak, the moment we are self-aware, we think in terms of groups, right? Well, little kids are like, mommy, what animal is that? And they're not asking who it is. They're asking what, right? They're
Yeah.
asking for a species of thing,
Yeah, that's right.
right?
Yeah,
And
that's what exactly the children are trying to do, is to be able to categorize or bring things together in the right analogy, so that the right communion, so that
mhm,
they can then distinguish, like you said, groups, because people don't realize that you're there, everything is a group. Like everything
yes,
that you can perceive in the world is already a group.
that's
And so
right.
that's right. So it's like,
Right.
that's
Humans,
not as
cats,
simple. It's
dogs,
not.
tables, chairs, balls, spheres, like, right, yeah, like all of that sort of stuff, right? Um, we think in terms of groups. So the big question with realism is, you know, why, right? The question is, when the mind does that, is it abstracting from the world or identifying in the world or whatever it is, right? Is there something out there? Are those structures actually out there and reflective of the way the world is?
Mhm.
And if so, the answer is you're a realist because they're real, right? Or is it all just sort of chaotic happenstance, amorphous matter, and the mind is inventing mental fictions in order to group and categorize and interpret stuff that really isn't, organized in the
Yeah,
first place.
there's
It's
no
creating.
relationship between the two. Yeah.
Right, right. And so if you say that, then you're a nominalist, right? From the Latin nomen, meaning these are just names that the mind is coming up with and projecting and creating structures and organizations. And I think really in some ways, and I won't go into it here, but I think in some ways that's the history of ideas, right?
Mhm.
You look at the rise of empiricism and modernity and everything that follows after that. It's just exploring the nominalist road. That's what it's doing.
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas prior to that, the medievals, the ancients, that's the realist road. People like Socrates and Plato, even Pythagoras, and then into the medievals, the Jews, the Christians, they were realists. And so once you're a realist, once you're on the road of realism, which I embrace because I believe in properly functioning faculties, right? Because if my faculties are aimed at telling me true things about the world, and one of the most basic things that it does is say, that's a table, that's a chair, that's a human, that's a cat, right? If that's central to all thinking and
Yeah.
reasoning, right? And I say reasoning because logic is based on groups. You can't engage in logic without groups. Um, so if that's what, all thinking and reasoning does, and I presume that my thinking and reasoning is aimed at truth telling, I have to presume at the outset realism, right?
Mhm.
Now, the thing is, realism naturally starts to raise other questions like, well, why are those structures there? And one of the things that's most fascinating to me is that realism, one of the ways of framing the question, rather than the realist nominalist way I just framed it, is to say, does mind emerge out of matter as a product of it after the fact,
Mhm.
right? Or is mind in some ways prior to matter structure and giving it structure and organization?
Yeah, constraining it, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the fact of the matter is there is no way of saying if you're going to be a materialist, an atheist, a nominalist, you have to say that mind is sort of an emergent property,
Yeah.
right? That somehow the matter just sort of evolved, it chaotically developed over time. You get complex organisms that eventually become conscious, and you have to make it a product of matter. But once you say that, then it makes sense that you would have to say that mind is also imposing all these structures, because those structures we're describing are mental structures,
Yeah.
right? Ideas, rules, principles, logic, order, and yet if you're a realist and you're saying, well, no, order and groups and structures are just there, right? They're part of the fabric of reality. Then you actually have to suggest the opposite. You have to suggest that somehow the principles of mind and of ideas and of reason are there at the foundations, giving structure to reality. And once you say that, now you have to say, well, then that means that the world emerges from something like a mind.
Yeah.
And now I'm back to something like God, at least something godlike. Now, the reason I think this is important is because what that means is once you look at the world that way, whether you're looking at it through like Plato's realism, or Aristotle's realism, or Philo of Alexandria's Jewish realism, or, Gregory of Nyssa's Christian realism, right? Whatever it is. What happens is that knowledge and reason becomes inherently mystical.
Mm-hmm.
That as I look out and I recognize a structure, I recognize that's Jonathan is human, right? Okay, got it. I am in some ways abstracting, apprehending, partaking in a divine idea,
Yeah.
right? There is something inherently mystical just about the fact that the mind that gives structure and order to the world is something that my mind either is a spark of, if I'm a pagan like Stoic, right? Or is an image of, if I'm a Jew or a Christian. And that image, I'll go with image since I'm an Orthodox Christian, is apprehending something that originates from the divine mind just in the act of perception.
Yeah.
And I say, even in the act of perception, you don't even have to go as far as reason, right? When I look out right now, I look out and I see, okay, we always talk this way, right? I see a table, I see a computer, I see a human, I see a camera, right? Whatever it is, right? The fact of the matter is, we always attribute that to the eye. That's the empiricist's mistake, as if the eye sees that. And the answer is like, no, the eye doesn't see that. The eye gives you all this data, right? It gives you this, stuff that we call light and shadow and all this sort of stuff. But what happens is that the mind so automatically says table, chair, floor, human, cat, dog. And it's so automatic and it's so immediate in identifying those groups, which is what allows you to differentiate all the things in your field of view. We presume it's the eye, but it's not. It's the mind. And if it's true, if realism is true, and that somehow these structures are divine in nature, they originate from God, whether you're a pantheist or you're a theist or you're a panentheist, you're a pagan, you're a Christian, you're some form of realist in this way, then what happens is that basic perception is already a mystical experience. So you want a mythologized world, you're already in it the moment you embrace realism. And now the reason I think that's so important is because rather than saying, well, there's a mystical side where we think about the occult and all that sort of stuff, and then there's a materialist side, rationalist side, and you create them separate, you treat them separately. I think the key is once you really embrace realism and you understand a realist metaphysic, you realize that it's all mystical. The world is mythologized. Yes, sure, it's haunted with spirits, angels, demons, God, all this sort of stuff. Yeah, that's real. You're a spiritual being, afterlife, all this sort of stuff. Sure, morality, all the rest. But even prior to that, just at the basic level of you existing in a structured way and you perceiving those structures, that basic level of existence is already mystical.
Yeah.
And I think if you can grasp that, now reason can begin to come in and provide some guidance, some discernment, right? About, what are the structures of morality? What are the spirits I should be talking to and shouldn't be talking to, right? Reason can start to have that say that's been sort of pushed to the side without in any way nullifying the pursuit of the mystical. So that would be my pitch.
Yeah, I totally agree. And anybody who's been watching this channel for a while knows that this argument that you're presenting so eloquently is one that I'm constantly referring to, which is that there's magic every time you perceive unity and multiplicity. Like,
Yeah.
because that is magic. That is the moving into one. It's all of it's like it's as mystical as the, we're all united with the one in
Right.
a Platinian mysticism. It's like that
Right.
happens when you're grabbing a pen. By the way, it's
Right.
like all the multiple moves into one, and then you have this mystical experience of the unity of the pen. It's like,
Right.
yeah, but then scale that up, and then you're in church and you're doing the Jesus prayer, or you're
Right.
your part, but it is all the way down into everyday perception.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I also think is, I think that because there's been people have mocked the ancient vision of how they would describe our experience of vision. Even Christ talks
All right.
about it, like that you have the ray that leaves the eye and hits the
Uh-huh.
object. I think that's absolutely true. I think that ray is attention, like that there is a ray that leaves your eye. We call it attention, and that attention, is the part of the magic which brings groups into one. And so it's not like it's not that it doesn't exist out there, like you said. It's not like it's imposed, but it's this deeply participative act where human consciousness participates in this magic and bringing these groups, because the groups can change,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Like the chair, if there's a fire in the room and I'm running out, it's like, the chair is no longer a chair. It's just an obstacle to get to the door. It's
Right.
real. It's a real obstacle that I have to get out of my way, or it's a weapon or whatever. Like, the groups can change and they're
Mhm.
all real, but there is an aspect of human consciousness which plays a part in that magical transformation.
Yeah. Well, I think that participatory side of perception that you're talking about, as far as I can tell, it's the only way to overcome skepticism. So all of skeptical arguments, whenever you look at the skepticism of the Enlightenment, right, it's always based on an alienation between the perceiver and that which is perceived, right? So this starts as a problem with, this becomes a problem at the outset with, with the empiricism of John Locke, because John Locke's sitting there and he's going, well, so basically the mind is a tabula rasa. It's this blank slate. It's kind of like clay. And then, it's passive as things come in, and it's kind of like, if you have a piece of clay and you press your fist
Yeah.
into it, and now there's that. And so that's kind of what it's like. The stuff out there comes in and it presses in and it leaves an impression. Well, what inevitably happens for Locke is then, first of all, you have a couple of problems that start to emerge. The one is that you have a verification problem, because all I have access to are the impressions that are in here. I don't know anything about the thing out there. So somehow demonstrating, and this is how skepticism always got off the ground in modernity and in the Enlightenment, was that well, you can't, how do you know it's the thing out there is like the thing in here, right? And then Locke only added problems when he started saying, well, yeah, and then there's primary and secondary qualities. So certain qualities like extension, those are true to the object out there. But smell, that's not real out there. Sight, color, that's not real. That's a phenomena in the mind. So now not only has Locke created an isolation, right? We only have access to the replica. We don't know if the replica is like that thing out there, but he's also given us reason to think there's discrepancy between
Right.
reality and the replica. So now he's actually creating problems. And in fact, one of the things that you'll appreciate, which I find so hilarious, is that this actually, artists went into crisis over painting because of this. They were like, we should all be sculptors because at least we're dealing in primary
Extension.
quality, right? But it's like, wait, so my paintings back there, none of that color is real? If I could step outside of my mind and look at it, it would just be flat goo? That's all it is? And so this is where a lot of the artists post Locke were like, oh, we should all be sculptors. But so that's that lack of that inability to verify and all that. That's part of what sort of fueled a lot of the skeptical projects, in modernity. But the fact of the matter is that isolation doesn't exist in realism,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because part of the issue is that with realism, the abstract, the generics, right? Those groups, they can be in multiple places, right? You can have three balls that all participate in sphericality. Sphericality is manifest in that one, that one, that one. Here in the case of you and me, humanity, human, is manifest in you, it's manifest in me simultaneously. We participate in the same generic, in the same form, right? Well, once you've said that one form can be in multiple objects, well, all of a sudden perception makes sense because what's happening is the form that's out there takes up residence in here, right? Because it doesn't have to just be out there. And so, in some ways, perception is isomorphic, meaning when I perceive you, I actually pull out of your matter all the properties that are there. I like those properties that are in you take up residence in here. Now, that doesn't mean that you take up residence in here, right? You are a discrete subject outside of me. But the properties of you do take up residence in here. And so you don't have a replica, right? You actually have a participation in the very things that are outside of me.
Hmm.
You know, and so in that way you overcome that gap, right? So the very first starting point of skepticism that requires, an isolation, right? Some sort of separation and isolation of, perception and the thing perceived is overcome by realism and by the very type of, participation in the object through perception